Welcome to the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act Virtual Pilgrimage. My name's the Reverend John Borthwick, and I'm the minister at St. Andrew's in Guelph. And as a part of our commitment to continuing to learn and gain knowledge and understanding in our relationships with the Indigenous community, seeking justice and reconciliation where we may be able to, seeking to grow in our relationships with the community that surrounds us, and just to increase our understanding of what the reality of the Indigenous community's history and legacy has been since contact, since legislated acts were put in place that essentially have framed how an Indigenous person might live in this country, a country that they as a people were living in long before settlers turned up. And so this book, what's fascinating about the book in one way is it seeks to show us a little bit about an act that's called the Indian Act. And for some of us, we may be thinking, oh, I don't think we're supposed to say Indian anymore. And we're going to learn a little more about that as we go. But it's also a book that's really helpful in giving us just some insights into the things that were legislated, put into law by the Canadian government that have resulted in the situation that the Indigenous community finds itself in today, and that continues to hold back the Indigenous community from being able to live freely, to live with the sort of liberty that we've come to expect as Canadians. So why this book? Why would I want to begin a journey in this book? Essentially, all I'm essentially trying to do, and I've did this before with our Me and White Supremacy virtual pilgrimage, is to really whet one's appetite for the book. It's not meant to replace the reading of the book. I really hope you go out and buy your own copy. I hope that you find a copy and do with it, as I've done, putting lots of little tags and stuff in it. I hope you read it well. I really wish that you would do that. It's meant to essentially be a companion to that conversation, something to listen to in the short time I share these little ruminations with you, something to maybe pray on or something to think about. Maybe it's a conversation starter. You're meant to be savoring, in a sense, this material, not just rushing through the book in a weekend and saying, oh, I read that book. Yeah, it's been tough. That's not what we're looking for here. What we're looking for is to have a sense of connecting with the reality of a law that is still in place today, that has been amended in some ways, but still seeks to treat the Indigenous community much differently than the rest of Canadians. So again, why this book? It's my understanding, and certainly for myself, I haven't gone on a deep dive on the Indian Act. It's my understanding that it's not something that's really well known. What I've come to learn is that this act has and continues to have a profound consequence on how people in the Indigenous community live their lives daily in Canada. Certainly when we talk about the material in this book, a kind of content warning in the sense of I want to promise that I'm not going to slime people with traumatic and difficult material to listen to. That's not my purpose here. But the concepts, the realities, the truths of our history and the history of the Indigenous community and its collision with the Canadian government and the religious community is a truth that we need to face. And so someone like me, who's resourced and white and privileged in so many ways, that has the time and opportunity to read a book like this, to record these kinds of sessions for you, it's important for me to take this seriously, to engage in this material, to be confronted by it and perhaps changed by the experience, because that's really what a pilgrimage is all about. It's about being changed through this journey, through this material and this book. I want to quote at the beginning of the book. There's a quote that Bob Joseph includes from Duncan Campbell Scott, and that's a name you'll hear a few times as we go through. He was the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1910, and he said this: It is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of the Department of Indian Affairs, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. It's an awful quote to hear by a Canadian government official. And in today's context, where mass graves have been uncovered, numbering in the tens of thousands of dead Indigenous children, it's not a discovery, it's not a surprise. The Indigenous community said that the bodies were there. People knew they were there. There was records of those bodies being there. It was certainly known by the government and known by those who were operating these quote-unquote schools that were really more like concentration camps, like those created by Nazi Germany during the Second World War to pursue their final solution to the Jewish question. Or if maybe that's too much to bear, in the least, these camps are similar to the camps that were established by the US and Canada to house Japanese, Canadians, and Americans during the Second World War. A restriction on a people, placing them in a specific area that was legislated. There was no choice here. This was where you had to go, where you had to send your children. And terming it the Indian problem tells us that it was an intentional, conscious, and heinous act perpetrated by the Canadian government, and in collaboration with Christian denominations like mine, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the United and Anglican Churches, and the Roman Catholic Church. These faceless historical entities certainly knew what they were doing. Their blind faith in what they were doing and seeing it as right and representative of the gospel message of Jesus, as a representative of those religious practices, is certainly sickening to me. As a representative of the Church in 2022, I am certainly ashamed of the grievous acts perpetrated by the Christian Church and the Government of Canada against the Indigenous peoples of Canada in the past and to this very day. To say I am sorry seems so much like, as the Bible might put it, vanity. Or as the translation of vanity might be, it's more like a vapor. It's something without substance, smoke. I believe we do need to say sorry. Don't get me wrong. I think that's important. But an apology is words. And it's a good first step towards reconciliation and justice. But without tangible action, it becomes meaningless. And to be fair to the denominations that I've mentioned already, many of them have taken tangible action along the way. But there's still much more to be done. And in some cases, some of the promises and commitments that were made many years ago still have not been fulfilled. And that came to light when the Pope recently visited Canada. I'm also very much aware that had I been a minister in the Presbyterian Church in Canada during the height of the residential school system, it's very likely that I would have been a part of the system that existed. I would have possibly been a supporter within a congregation that I might have been serving. I might have been sharing stories of what goes on at the residential schools, but in a much more light and positive way. It's possible that I might have even been serving as a leader of one of the schools across Canada. Those opportunities were available for ministers just like me in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And while time makes me brave to say that I'm opposed to it, I'm not naive enough to believe that had I been living during those times that I wouldn't have been such an active participant. So here I am, inviting us to begin a journey, a pilgrimage of sorts, and certainly in a virtual way, with the book 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. I believe it's important to become informed about our history with the Indigenous community, and through understanding be spurred to action. This particular book, well, it focuses on the Indian Act. It's a little bit of history, and it's a bit of history that we need to know. The Act, as I understand it from the book and from some of my own history background, having had degree in history. It really came to be through a report called the Bagot Report of 1844. And that really became the framework of this Indian Act that was established in 1876, a really long time ago. It recommended that there should be some kind of centralized control over all Indian matters, that children needed to be separated from their communities and culture and attend these kind of boarding schools. And it was encouraging the Indians to join this free enterprise system when it came to the sale of lands. And when Canada was formed by the British North American Act, or the Constitution Act it's now called, of 1867, the federal government was given exclusive jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for the Indians, a relationship that continues to this day to be extremely problematic. And again, we were hesitant to label the actions of the government. If we are hesitant to label the actions of the government as intentional, hear this language that actually exists in the Act itself. Hear the paternalism within it, when it states, "Every effort should be made to aid the red man in lifting himself out of his condition, to prepare him for a higher civilization." Wow. And if we're still not convinced of our government's intentions, I return to another quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, when he wrote this: "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not an Indian that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." Imagine the government of any country deciding that the best way forward for a group of perhaps easily identified people was to make them as a people disappear, their way of life, their language, their culture, to totally erase it from their country, from existence, that there would no longer be people who might call themselves whatever title they might use as a people. Their language would disappear, their culture would disappear, everything that made them who they were erased with intention. I'm reminded, and this might sound a little strange, but I'll try to make these parallels occasionally, maybe to help us understand it a little better. But I'm reminded of a quote from Braveheart, the movie Braveheart, where the King of England says, "The problem with Scotland is that it's full of Scots." And then he decides to reinstitute the practice of first night, where when a couple is married, who is under the protection of the Lord, who was an Englishman, the Lord had the right to take the bride first. A policy designed to potentially breed the Scots out of the country. Now, we call these types of policies and acts perpetrated by those with power and authority, what we call them genocide. Period. Genocide. And coming out of the Second World War and its language around the final solution, committees in the Canadian government did seem to acknowledge the problematic nature of the Indian Act, residential schools, and all these matters. It made recommendations, these committees, to see it amended, the Indian Act amended and reformed in a variety of different ways, but unfortunately, no substantive changes were really adopted. And the Act, to this day, remains largely unaltered from its original framework from all the way back in 1876. As the author Bob Joseph states, the Indian Act was and is an instrument of oppression. It directs the lives of Indigenous peoples every day. The book is a call to action. Knowing more about it will hopefully inspire us as citizens to encourage our government to dismantle the Indian Act once and for all. So thank you for joining me on this virtual pilgrimage. If you'd like to take time to read the Act in its entirety, you can find a link below with the full text, and you can learn more about the Indian Act at the Canadian government website and the newly named, no longer Indian Affairs, Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. You can find those at that section and check out those links. Thank you again for joining me on this pilgrimage. I hope you'll continue with me as we begin to take this journey through 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. Thank you.